موضوع الجلسة شيق جدا والمتحدثين جدا مميزين.
The topic of our session is very interesting and the speakers are exceptional, outstanding. They will be talking about the relationship between inequality and conflict, about refugees, about adaptation, about Palestine, and about the non-implementation of Agenda 20 and the incapacity to implement Agenda 2030 under the occupation. They will also be talking about long-term development and other interesting topics. Allow me to introduce to you our outstanding speakers, Mr. Rabie Nasr. He is one of the founders of the Syrian Center for Research and Studies, which is a research center, a non-profit research center. He works as a researcher in development matters. Ms. Amal Nasr is an economic expert at the Sana'a Strategic Studies Center. She is also one of the co-authors of a book on the economic policies adopted in the MENA region. Dr. Nasr Yassin is a professor of politics and planning at the American University of Beirut. He was also director of research at Hassan Fares Institute and worked as interim director of this institute. In 2020, he established the Observatory of Lebanon Crisis in order to follow up and monitor on crisis and suggest recommendations. He also participated in the AUB initiative for refugees, gathering the faculty of AUB in order to respond to the refugee crisis. And finally, Professor Shatha Abu Srour. She is a human rights activist and working on promoting the rights of people with disabilities. She is an associate secretary of the Arab Institute for People with Disabilities. She is very interested in research studies and reports related to disabilities, and she is active at the national and regional level. I would also like to remind the speakers that you only have 10 minutes, and I would kindly ask you to respect the time that is given to you in order to have enough time at the end for discussion. I start with Mr. Rabie Nasr. Can you please tackle the matter of the link between inequality and conflict? We give you the floor. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this session today. So I have a few ideas to share with you within the 10-minute time, and unfortunately, we cannot say that we are totally free from fear in the context that we live in our region. I will be talking about injustice and not inequality. So I will be talking about injustice, which is actually one of the deep dimensions of the political, economic, and social aspects of inequality. And this, of course, under the 2030 agenda or framework. And here I would like to highlight two ideas. First, the problematic of Agenda 2030, which has already been discussed, and notably in the region. We have hundreds of indicators. We have a lot of details about many aspects and dimensions. However, this is not enough to conclude that we are on our way to a total system failure or collapse. I will give the example of the Syrian conflict. When there is political oppression, this has a double effect on all other factors, and of course this leads to the failure of all other indicators and criteria. Each country, each context has its own particularity. However, when there is systematic exclusion conducted by the authorities or by the governments in place, this might lead to the collapse of all other efforts, and this might hinder the achievement of any sustainable development goal. So if we looked at Lebanon, for example, 2 or 3 years ago, we wouldn't have guessed that the country was going towards the collapse that it is witnessing today. So we have to adopt an a holistic approach and not only focus on specific indicators. So I believe that for our region, we have to have an overall look. We have to go back in time. We have to look at the conflict in Iraq. We have to look at the conflict in Yemen. We have to look at different events and incidents that took place all over the region in order to understand what is happening. So we are talking, unfortunately, about a region that is heading towards more conflicts. The current political discourses, whether at the national or the local or the regional levels, are discourses that haven't learned any lesson from the past. On the contrary, we see that there is still enthusiasm to trigger even more conflicts and wars, and we are still seeing the a very strong historical greed to maintain the occupation over Palestine. We have new patterns of intervention as well, like the direct military interventions of great powers, China, Russia, and the US in the region. And the Iraqi invasion is an example, not only one example, but this has accelerated some other events lately. And lately, we have also seen the presence of international polls on the ground in Syria. And so these are new patterns, and that are taking the conflicts into totally new directions, and are affecting also the cooperation model all over the world. We have another pattern or tendency, which is terrorism and all the aspects of terrorism. Another matter I would like to highlight is the changing regional role of states like Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and other countries, and their direct intervention in many countries in the region. And this is also a clear indicator that that we are still heading towards more conflicts. This new role, has been accompanied with a new political and social discourse, and with new elements of a renewing tension, which will also be prorogating the conflicts. There are also some disagreements that have not yet turned into conflicts, like the tensions over oil, gas, tensions over political power. And all this, of course, makes us say that we are heading towards more conflicts in the region.
داخل الدول لدينا دول التي فيها
نزاعات. Inside the countries, of course, so we have countries that are suffering from existing conflicts now. And these conflicts have conveyed many messages so far. And my question to you is, how can we monitor this in our or through our SDG 2030 SDGs? So, for example, there is now the normalization of relationships with the oppression. So there are some countries that are getting used to violations of human rights, that are comparing, for example, between the intensity of these violations from a country to the other, and then maybe normalizing these violations. So if the violation that is taking place in a particular country is less severe than the violation that is taking place in Yemen, for example, then this first violation can be considered as normal or not as bad by some countries. And this is very serious and very dangerous. Some of the indicators adopted in the last 10 years were related to the numbers of deaths, the numbers of IDPs, forced migrants, And the region has become the black region of the world when it comes to intensity of conflicts and the severity of violations that are taking place and that are still taking place, unfortunately. Another matter is the politicization of the identity. It is a matter that needs also to be monitored. It is not only limited to a country or a society, but the limits of this politicization of identity go beyond the borders of the country or of the region. The identities are being exploited politically in order to nurture, for example, some terrorist tendencies sometimes, or for other purposes. In addition, in the region, we have seen the emergence of conflicting parties and we do not have any model of democracy in our region. We are in an area of oppression, and the oppression of states themselves and oppression by other powers as well. In addition, the investment in conflict economies is not limited anymore to the conflict zones, but are also going beyond the conflict zones. Today, we are seeing networks of smuggling of weapons, for example, that are trans-border. These networks that violate all laws, all regulations, and that have become somehow beyond any accountability. In addition, there is the use of mercenaries and armed groups have now recruited hundreds of thousands of young men. Where are we from this relationship between injustice and conflict? So, of course, there are basic elements for injustice, like oppression, for example, oppression that is depriving groups and individuals from participation at the long run. So, Rabie, we still have 1 minute and a half. Or 2 minutes.
راح اقول بس مجموعه افكار رئيسيه. الفكره الاولى
So just a few basic ideas. I was talking about political oppression, which is one of the main roots of the conflict. And during the past 10 years, the developments in the Arab world is an evidence to this. So we also have the new neoliberal policies, which have created a lot of gaps, and this has also created polarization, social polarization, because of these discrepancies. Conflict and new types of injustice. So, in addition to killing and displacement, armed conflicts, of course, have generated torture, abduction, children recruitment, etc. And of course, this cannot be addressed overnight. We need to focus on new social and economic approaches that are able to address these matters from a holistic approach and from different dimensions. The missing policies are the dynamics that we need today, but they are still lacking. So one of these policies first is to a transformation of or a political transformation towards participation and towards a society that really wants democracy. And it's not enough to say democracy, because there are democracies or there are elections that can vote for Trump, but there are also elections that can lead or that can bring someone like Nelson Mandela to power. So what we want is a change, a political transformation in order to ensure the good democracies, in order to ensure more participation, in order to ensure more solidarity economies and economies based on solidarity. Today, there is an overall mentality that competition economies and economies based on competition are the ones that lead to freedom, while in reality, sometimes this is leading to the monopoly of an elite. The monopoly by an elite of the economic resources. So what we need is more solidarity We need a strong environment and an environment that builds the capacities of the social capital, a social capital that is raised on cooperation, trust, and solidarity. How can we measure the social capital? This is also one major question that we need to ask ourselves in the region. And of course, as I mentioned, we need policies to face the politicization of identity. I thank you for your attention. Thank you, Rabie, for your valuable intervention. You have spoken about the local oppression forces, about the new discourses that we are hearing. You have spoken about also the different contexts, and I believe that your presentation is a good introduction to Dr. Amal Nasr's presentation. So what is the relationship between the humanitarian crisis, emergency, and development in light of the Yemeni context, and what are the needed response policies and the policies that we need for recovery and for sustainable development at the medium and long term. Thank you, Joe, for your introduction and for your kind words. I have a presentation to share.
بالنسبة لليمن موضوع الصلة بين عمليات الإغاثة
So regarding Yemen and the link between emergency, protection, safety, the issue is a bit complicated.
نظرة سريعة على إنه يعني هذه الأسئلة المطروحة حاليا بس كبداية.
So I'd like to answer some of the questions and take an overview of the situation in Yemen in order to understand the complexity. So currently, these are the most expensive in the world in Yemen. With the continuation of the war in several regions, the expenses are increasing. 24 million out of 30 million Yemeni require some form of human assistance. 20 million are in need of food assistance. And I think that this is going to increase later on. Yemen does not export refugees. However, there are a lot of internally displaced persons that are estimated to be around 3 million persons, and it will increase given the recurrent wars and conflicts. Yemen also faces humanitarian issues, especially with regards to COVID-19. In addition to the repercussions of the war, knowing that more than half of the hospitals or healthcare institutions are either not working or destroyed. In addition, humanitarian relief financing or funding is decreasing in Yemen due to two factors. First is the extended war, and the donors no longer wanted to continue subsidizing or funding the relief, as well as COVID-19 repercussions and how they affected the donors. Donors recently pledged $1.7 billion, decrease in more than 50% compared with the prior years. This is a quick overview of the humanitarian situation. With regards to the relationship between the humanitarian crisis and the development crisis in Yemen, I think that it is a loop. What came first, the chicken or the egg? This is the situation that we're currently facing. The war impeded the development efforts, and reversed the achievements that were made over the last 20 years according to the UNDP report. The current humanitarian crisis reflects the fragility of the situation prior to the war, as well as the weak development policies. The current approach adopted by the different relief or development programs of the United Nations, as well as international relief agencies, relate humanitarian relief with the war and the continuation of this war. There is a strong desire to provide sustainable development processes that ensure limited income for the most at risk and most marginalized persons. I think that this faces political impediments, first of all, first of which is the conflict, the continuous conflict in Yemen. We have not reached a point where a war ended in order for us to say that humanitarian operations and relief operations need to go in line with the development. The development is threatened either by the physical destruction of facilities or by different forces and political balances changing and increasing. We are holding several discussions with stakeholders. They express grave needs that do not allow them to continue investing in Yemen, especially the political aspects related to the current situation in Yemen, as well as the conditions according to which these organizations work. In addition, the political impact might be translated as a normalization of the conflict, and it might prorogate the conflict or empowerment of one party at the expense of another, or representation of one or more political parties, depending on how we divide them. In addition, COVID-19 diminished the financing of all operations, be them humanitarian or development processes. The discussions are currently set aside because priority is given to humanitarian relief, especially that the country is facing hunger and famine with the regression of all relief operations and financing. Therefore, in order to have a true discussion on progress, we need to reach a ceasefire, first of all, and then prepare political discussions to reach a political solution. And I think that we would be very ambitious if we call for a political solution now. However, we can call for a ceasefire until or in order for the humanitarian and development aid to move forward. In order to achieve recovery in Yemen, on the short term, I tried to draft a few policies. For example, one of the main issues or causes of the humanitarian crisis is the economic one rather than the political or conflict-related ones. Therefore, it is important to address economic structural issues and to support the value of the currency. It is a matter that is addressed by everyone and should be considered as a priority in any negotiations or in any political settlement discussions in the country. The stakeholders need to focus on this in Yemen. In addition, As we said, the humanitarian relief operations in Yemen are very expensive. There are talks that the United Nations requested an evaluation of the relief operations in Yemen, and a true assessment should be done in order to ensure that the resources are used in a more transparent manner, and to continue to support economic recovery, livelihoods, projects and programs in Yemen. Maybe they can be reduced, however, it would be catastrophic to completely stop them. Regarding the responses required on the long term, we believe that the conflict in Yemen is interrelated and is complicated. It is the result of years of political misuse and abuse. Therefore, it is important to support sustainability, to support transparency, and it is important to support the different factors in Yemen that result. Well, Yemen technically is a country that has a lot of agricultural lands. However, arable lands amount to 2% of Yemen. Therefore, I think that agrarian reform is important in order to avoid repeating the same crisis in the country. International financial institutions policies focus on the oil sector and disregards other sectors, and due to the war, we have witnessed an end and a fall of the economic situation in the country. Therefore, it is important to invest better in the education process. We are living in a poor country where the youth and the children constitute the fuel behind wars and conflicts. Had we had better educational policies or better investment in educating bigger percentage of the youth and children in the country, I don't think the war would have gone on for so long. Therefore, it is also important to address the diversity inside the country instead of focusing only on gender equality. Yemen includes minorities and is a diverse country, and it is important to take the different opinions into consideration when thinking of drafting new policies to ensure sustainable development and peace, which are the objectives of everyone nowadays. I tried to briefly address the relationship between development and humanitarian and relief aid in Yemen. Thank you for your important intervention. We give the floor now to Dr. Nasr. You have extensive experience in refugee rights, including combating the hatred rhetoric, the rights of migrant or refugees. Can you please talk to us about the informal adaptation processes, and in your opinion, what is required in order to achieve transformation in the challenges that refugees face in the region within the Agenda 2030? I give you the floor, Dr. Nasr. Thank you for holding this session. I do not have a presentation, but I would like to share with you a few points. First of all, I would like to determine a few key points. As our colleague Amal said, the Arab region or more than 8 million refugees, in addition to internally displaced persons that are estimated at 14 million, or between 13 and 14 million internally displaced persons in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. There are great numbers of refugees and internally displaced persons. The situation is known to all. However, I would like to add a few points that can help direct and guide the discussion, especially when it comes to development in the region and achieving development goals. The majority of refugees come from countries that have historically suffered from fragility in their official and unofficial structures. The internally displaced persons and refugees live in countries that suffer from problems in governance, absence of social and legal protection, etc. And this vulnerability applies to both refugees and residents. Second, the majority, if not all, refugees reside in poor areas. So the majority of refugees now live in areas, cities, and neighborhoods outside the refugee camps that are known to be poor. With the increased number of refugees living in these regions, I think we have a compounded poverty geography. The majority of Syrian refugees since 2011 and afterwards currently reside in regions and villages that are considered as the poorest in Lebanon, which leaves great repercussions on competitiveness and the social tensions that might happen between refugees and the residents of these regions or host communities. I'm addressing this because it also leaves repercussions on how programs, objectives, and priorities are determined, and that are often failing because they do not consider the poor nature of these geographies. After the Cold War, all refugee crises becomes more difficult and might last up to 20 years. The long-term effect of these problems are compounded by the absence of a political solution in the countries where the original countries of these refugees. This affects the response mechanisms to the issues of refugees. So when we talk about development goals and implementation, it is important to take into account all these factors, specifically when it comes to how host countries deal with the refugees as if they deal with them as if refugee crisis end in a short period. We're talking about the generations that will be born and live in refugee countries, similarly to what's happening in Syria. There are weak, durable solutions currently provided to the refugees. When we talk about the return of refugees, I believe that it is highly improbable given the current situations. I think that it is quite difficult for reasons inside Syria, such as the inability to find or to reach a political solution that might lead to reconstruction or to reconciliation also, that would allow the refugees to return home. This is key because, as I said, the refugee crises are often extended, therefore return of refugees often becomes lengthy. When I talk about resettlement of refugees, some Lebanese tend to understand it as keeping the refugees in Lebanon. When we talk about resettlement, we mean refugees living in third countries, moving from Lebanon or Jordan to other countries that are more developed, such as European countries, USA, or Australia. They are very slow, and this is related to how countries deal with the refugee crisis. These countries are funding these responses, and they have yet to find a solution that would allow resettling these refugees in more advanced countries that are able to provide them with social protection. In addition, the integration of refugees in their countries, in their host countries, is becoming weaker due to the hatred rhetoric, etc. So far, any solution for the refugee crisis becomes almost impossible. But I'd like to add one more point, specifically as pertains to the inability to find a permanent solution for the refugees. These issues are related to the identity policies, which puts a lot of countries, especially advanced or developed countries, at or in a difficult situation that renders the relationships between refugees and host communities more difficult and renders ineffective any assistance programs. This led to increased violence and tensions. In addition, separatist tendencies are currently taking place, especially as they relate to the current crisis. They are affected also by the inability to find a solution for a refugee crisis. This tendency might lead to disintegration of several governments in the region, such as Yemen, Sudan, Syria. These have to be addressed and discussed in a serious matter. This allows me to draw the following conclusion. Maybe I should have done more analysis, however, we don't have time, but we are going to face difficult decades when it comes to development, and any development achievements that we want are now far-fetched, and they are closely and tightly related to the conflicts and crises in the region. This is where our discussions should start. I do not see any future for the development aid, and unless we approach political change and the creation of regimes that are more encompassing of the different sectors and sections of the society. We talk about resilience, and we have some political projects. However, they have yet to achieve a certain target. At the contrary, they might fail because they are often short-term and short-lived and tributary of the availability of funding. Therefore, Joe, I do not see any real change before a political change takes place, and this political change should be reliant upon finding inclusive structures away from any discrimination. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nasr. Mrs. Shatha, you're going to talk about the root causes of conflicts in the region, in Yemen, the refugee crisis in Lebanon and in Syria. We'd like to hear from you about Palestine under the occupation. Where is Palestine from the implementation of Agenda 2030, and what are the challenges that different segments face? Mrs. Shatha, can you hear us? So I can hear you all. I know that I have around 5 minutes. Thank you for hosting me and for organizing this conference. It is important for all of us to agree on the difficulty and the impossibility of talking about human rights and development pillars in any country and for any people so long as they are living under any form of occupation. Usually, the occupation often tends to circumvent and stop all opportunities of growth and development in general. And in order to use the time allocated to me, how can we address how is occupied Palestine achieving development or not, it is always important to remember that we talk about oppressive policies that shows division in the country. The Palestinians are incapable of making their decisions. Different lands are divided. We are facing a complete embargo on the Gaza Strip. The different resources are not provided, either financial resources or natural resources. We talk about protocols and agreements signed with the Zionist state, which limits the opportunities to promote the economic situation in Palestine, let alone the limitations imposed on export and import processes. It is important, therefore, to talk about the different troubles, and more important than natural resources are financial resources. It is important to understand the value of the different resources. The Palestinians are unable to achieve their rights, and they are incapable of creating their own future. Therefore, this person is a Palestinian who is unable to trust because they've been suffering so much. This human being should be the main factor behind, or the main engine behind any development process is not taken into account. Therefore, it is important for us to open the horizons wide in order to allow any development process to respond to the needs, rights, and ambitions of the Palestinian people. Regarding the indicators, and without delving into the statistics, the Central Statistics Agency always says that 1 out of 3 Palestinians live under the poverty line. The Palestinian government lacks the ability to lay the proper foundations to ensure political or social protection, and instead of or we are witnessing a lot of interventions that aim at finding a proper solution. However, they are failing with regards to the projects and programs designed to ensure response to poor families. We often find that they do not meet the minimum requirements of decent life. Or allow the ability to benefit from the support provided by international organizations, knowing that these international organizations do not take the Palestinian situation into account. If we are to talk about persons with disabilities in general, and the marginalized persons, it is important to highlight the absence of sufficient reports and studies that address the human rights and the livelihood of the persons with disabilities living under the occupation. Rights are related and inalienable. Therefore, violation of any right shall mean violation of all rights. The persons with disability are unable to move freely. We'd also like to remind you that the Israeli occupation and the different inhuman practices constitute one of the factors that lead to the spread of disability in Palestine, and it is important to say that this is a policy that is adopted by the Israeli government to cause disability among Palestinians. Therefore, persons with disabilities should not suffer from these violations. On the contrary, it is important to find a solution
شتى بعد معنا دقيقة لو سمحت.
You still have 1 more minute. In the Gaza Strip, we are witnessing the problems with provision of or supply of electricity. There is a relationship between the occupation policies and the provision of all services. The financing is often conditioned, and it isolates all the beneficiaries, especially those who are persons with disabilities and are excluded from any services. In addition, agendas are imposed on a lot of official and unofficial institutions without responding to the needs of the Palestinians. It is also important to say that, similarly to other marginalized people, the persons with disabilities suffer more either from conflicts or COVID-19, and they are excluded from any relief and humanitarian interventions and support.